Hi guys, welcome to Art Club 101. Thanks for joining me today. We're going to start out by doing a drawing of this succulent picture that I found online. I'm going to be doing a watercolor painting today, so get your watercolors ready, get your pencil ready, your paper towels, and then the first thing is that I'm going to start drawing the shapes of the petals. I want to mark the boundaries of where I want my succulent to end on my paper. So I don't know if you can see those, but I have some marks showing me about the size that I want to have this succulent. I don't want it to be too big or too small. I don't want it going off of my paper, but I also don't want it to be too small. If you do want to do that, that's fine. It's just personal preference, but I kind of wanted something that was a little bigger in the center of my paper. So I'm going around and I'm drawing each one of those petals as I'm looking at the photo for reference. You could also look directly at a succulent. If you have one at your house and you want to observe that as you're doing your drawing, you can do that as well. Just getting the basic shapes on there, starting in the middle and working my way out. And you know, you'll also notice that there's not the exact same amount of petals on the succulent or leaves on the succulent as there would be in the exact picture. But I'm not doing an exact picture. I'm doing a painting, and it's my version, and I think it'll still look awesome even if it has some more petals. So now that I'm done with the basic shapes of the leaves on my succulent, I'm going to move on to the watercolors. I'm seeing some kind of muted purples. I see light greens in there and also some teals. So I'm going to start with my purples first. They're going to be darker towards the center. I'm going to kind of fill in each petal or each leaf except for the outside edge of it. I'm going to leave that white. And that is because I see some highlights there and I want those to be highlighted later. So I'm going to use that light purple and I'm going to fill in almost the whole leaf, but then leave the outer edge white. As I'm moving out on each one of these leaves, I am going to be adding more water to my brush so that the color purple will get a little bit lighter and a little bit lighter as I move outward. So again, these are just getting lighter and lighter, and then you'll notice on the photo that the leaves that are on the outer edge are kind of a teal and kind of a darker green. So I'm going to get pretty close to the edge with these leaves that are purple, and then I'm going to rinse my brush and start with the greens and the teals for those outer leaves. So fixing to start with that. And again, remember when you're doing watercolors, to get the lighter color, you just add more water. If you want the darker color, you just add more paint. Also, don't be afraid to mix your paint. So on these, the purple, I used purple, a little bit of black, and a little bit of blue to get that shade of purple I have. And then for the teal, I did green and blue, and I think I also added a little bit of black to that paint color that I used there too. So now, what I'm going to do is we're going to do some more details on the highlights here. So I noticed in the photo that I'm seeing a lot of yellow on the highlights. So I'm going to go ahead and come in with a smaller brush and I'm going to get the yellow watercolor and go over the highlights that I left white on each one of the leaves. I keep calling them petals, but they're not petals, they're leaves. And I'm going to do that on as many of them as I see on the photo, or around the same amount. And then I also see some orange highlights, so I'm going to be doing some orange highlights. And then also there's kind of a pinkish reddish highlight that I see on some of the leaves as well. So just adding those highlights, there's the orange ones. And then here pretty soon I'm going to move on to that darker kind of reddish pink highlights as well. That's going to make those leaves look like they're curved and they're three-dimensional by adding the darks and the lights. And it's, you know, it's coming together. It's not all detailed yet, but I'm working more towards those details as we go. We start with color blocking first, which is getting your basic colors on there, and then you move more towards the details as you work on a piece of art. So the neat thing with watercolors is you can also let them dry and you can layer with other shades of watercolor. So towards the center of the painting, it's dried, and now I'm coming in with a brownish color towards the center of the petals, and I'm basically defining the petals a little bit more, but mainly what I want to do is I want to show the shadowed areas. So on the photo, you'll notice that the shadowed areas are always going to be towards where that leaf comes into the center of the flower. So I'm going to darken up the areas where the leaf comes into the center. And then I'm going to water it down with a little bit of water, but that's going to remain dark, and that's going to make it look like there's depth. So you don't want to cover the whole thing with the darker color, but you do want to look and see where the shading is on each one of those leaves and add in that darker part to make it look more three-dimensional. So I'm going to do that to each one of these leaves here. If it gets too dark and you're worried about it, just add a little bit of water to your brush and blend it in a little bit on the edges. You could also do any contouring on these leaves that you see. So if there's kind of a ridge in one of them and you want to add a little bit of a ridge there, you can use that same color to add a ridge down the center of the leaf, or a little bit more shadowing on one side of it to make it look like it's standing out from the other leaves that are there. So as you'll notice, the center of the succulent is starting to really come together now. It's starting to look more three-dimensional, and that's because I'm adding that another layer of that watercolor on. So that first layer that we did of those colors is already dried, and then I'm coming back with a second layer. Another thing with watercolors that you always want to do is tape your paper down, because it will help it keep from warping. And so that is something that I always do when I'm working on watercolors, and I don't take the tape off until it has already dried. Taking the tape off can be a little tricky. You always want to take it off at an angle and go very slow so it doesn't tear your paper. But anyways, I'm continuing to move out on each one of those leaves, adding the shading and the shadows and the shadowed areas. So as you can see on the purple leaves, I used more of a dark purple to do the shading, and on the teal leaves, I'm using a darker teal to do the shading on those teal leaves. Now I'm coming in, I'm adding more highlights. I'm getting really, really nice white watercolor paint and coming back on top of the yellows and highlights that I made before, and adding another highlight wherever I see them on these leaves on the photo. And it's really starting to make that painting come forward and look, each one of those petals or leaves to look more three-dimensional. So don't be afraid to do that. If you have the kind of watercolors that are liquid, you want a really strong white. So don't be afraid to use lots of that paint and very little water, and that will make that white really stand out nice and bright on your painting. Again, doing the shading on those outer teal leaves that are on the outer edge. I'll probably add some more details to those as I go along. But again, the details don't come until the very end. Do your colors first, then come back in, do your darker shadings where the shadows are, and then do your bright highlights as you're working on your artwork. You could do a succulent just like the one I'm doing, or you could do something else. I hope you enjoyed watercolors today with me.